So, I mean, we can sit here and talk about all sorts of different scenarios all day, right?
Yes.
Okay, but again, you come out of treatment. Your family members all drink, or use. Okay, your friends all drink and use, right? The only way you know how to socialize is to go out and have a drink, or go to a bar and have a drink, or whatever it is. Going forward from treatment, I think that's why aftercare and being involved in mutual self-help groups, okay, where it is
Yeah.
an important thing, hey?
Definitely. And I think, it's important for the family to also form part of that
That's
aftercare.
yeah. How
You
does the
know?
family sort of like? But I mean, again, you come out and the family's a mess as well.
Yes.
It's I suppose that's why it's important to get the family in as part of the process. Look, I'm not a fan of people changing their entire existence
Mm,
for
mm,
for somebody else who's the one with the problem.
mm,
So,
mm.
I don't expect my parents to stop drinking, for example, or my wife to stop having a drink every now and then
Yes.
because I have a problem, right? Having said that, though, I think there is and that's a sort of like follow on. What support could family members offer loved ones post rehab with specific focus on aftercare process without sort of changing their entire life?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think I had a patient yesterday tell me, they feel extremely isolated and alone because the family has stopped inviting them to family occasions or special occasions or events. And when the person asked them why, they said, no, we're doing it because we want to protect you. We
Mm.
want to, we don't want to put you in a difficult position. But at the end of the day, for that person, they experience it as a form of rejection or abandonment, or like a lot of them would tell me, I feel like a burden. I
Mm.
feel like when they need to, when they do invite me, it's like, oh, now that person's coming along, we can't drink in front of him or we can't enjoy ourselves. And that's not necessarily the point. Yes, to some extent, life should carry on as normal, but there should also be a level of awareness. It's also the patient's responsibility to identify what they can and what they can't handle. And I think that's very important. At the end of the day, a patient might RSVP for a wedding or an event, but had a terrible week at work at week, had a terrible week at work, or really at the end of the day struggled a lot that week with personal issues. Coming that Saturday, they might feel, you know what, I'm already craving, I'm not in a good space. It's that patient's responsibility to then tell the family member, thank you that you invited me, and although I did RSVP, today might not be the best day for me to be put in that position. But to just be excluded from the bat off often makes them feel, well, what's the use then,
Mm.
and I always say to my patients, if you view recovery as a punishment, if you're seeing it as a prison sentence or as a restriction on your life, you're really walking into it with the wrong mindset. And especially if the family kind of adds on to that by making them feel as though, their life should now be extremely restricted in terms of what they can and cannot form part of, they might then feel that for the rest of their life they're going to have to live in a very limited capacity, and which often makes them very despondent at the end of the day. So I think there should be balance in everything that a person does post rehab, but I think if the family can form part in some way of the aftercare, I often urge family members, go and enter your own therapy process. You don't get born with a recipe book on how to support somebody in addiction.
Sure.
You're not supposed to have that knowledge. It's not something every person or every family goes through. So you need to educate yourself. And might not be the best thing to try and educate yourself via Google or via talking to somebody's family that has gone through something like that. Try and
And
maybe
things have probably evolved into a very like maladaptive, is that the right word?
yes,
Maladaptive kind of scenario anyway. So
yes,
so I think yeah, family members getting into treatment for their own process,
yes,
definitely a big
yes.
important thing, yeah.
Because obviously part of rehab is to have some form of family intervention whilst you're in the program. But sometimes the family is sitting with such intense emotions themselves. I mean, you said earlier in the beginning of the podcast, you said, they're often feeling quite resentful themselves, maybe angry, disappointed, feeling a sense of betrayal. So it's not just easy to say, well, put those feelings aside and now support the person unconditionally. I mean, at the end of the day, we need to be realistic here. So if you feel like, I'm still dealing or grieving those emotions, you might need to, enter into your own process in order to work through that, in order to be in some way objective or neutral to reintegrate the person into your life at the end of the day.
So, like, look, I went on holiday once, in early recovery with my folks, and there was a liquor cabinet. Okay, my old man didn't hide the booze.
Yes,
Didn't hide the booze. I opened the cupboard, and not knowing that there was all this booze in there, and it was the middle of the night, and I found all this booze. But I was on a path where I was like choosing recovery. I don't want to drink. My old man even said, he offered me a drink. He's like, you haven't had a drink in a while. Surely you can have a glass of wine with dinner, or whatever the case, right? And it was really up to me to say, nah, it's okay. I've got a problem. I don't want to get involved, right?
Yes, definitely. I think at the end of the day, and that was going to be one of our questions, is what is the family's responsibility post-rehab, And I think it's very important that the patient knows what would help them, or what type of support do they need, because every patient is different. One patient would tell me, I really don't want my wife to give me a watch on my first month of sobriety, because that just reminds me, it makes me feel in some way as I'm being, rewarded as a child, or as if I'm being patted on the back in a patronizing way. Okay. And somebody else might say, I'll be very sad, or I would feel quite despondent if I don't get some form of recognition, So that's why the family therapy is so important in the rehab process, because by the time that you go as the family member to fetch your loved one from rehab, this conversation should have already taken place. This is not something that you should start discussing post-rehab. Everybody in some way, shape or form should be on the same page by the day of discharge. The patient should be able, and obviously it's gonna be adjusted as time goes by. I mean, the patient might think that they're going to be okay in a specific scenario, but then coming out into the real world, they might start feeling uneasy. And then, like you say, it's their responsibility to communicate that. And I think communication is so important. But what my patients often tell me is, I don't feel comfortable communicating. Because the moment I start talking about it, they start to either become panicky, or they make a joke, or they, become sarcastic, or at the end of the day, they become resentful and pull all things from the past in order, to kind of prove their point. So I think how that conversation takes place is very important at the end of the day, So, but it is, it is the patient's ultimate responsibility and decision whether they actually want to stay in recovery or in sobriety. The family's role is purely to support on an emotional level, to be able to validate feelings, to be able to give praise where praise is due. I'm not saying that a person needs to comment on every single or on behavior that doesn't reflect changed behavior. But if you see the slightest difference in your loved one's way of responding or way of dealing with things, obviously in a positive sense, comment on it, identify to the person that you can actually see that they're trying or that they bring about changes. So I think we as human beings, we respond to some form of positive reinforcement or reward,
Sure.
If we keep on trying, and I'm saying trying because it doesn't come naturally for the patient. They're wired to act and think differently. So for them to respond even in the slightest bit of way differently than how they used to is a milestone for them. That is really something that takes a lot of self-discipline, a lot of conscious thinking. So for them to hear somebody say, sure, you know what, I saw that, well done. That's something that I really, I picked up on it. That motivates them to repeat that behavior. But if they're constantly just hearing the criticism or hearing the judgment or hearing things about, like I said, about the past mistakes, then they start feeling, but you know what, for what am I, or what's the motivation to keep or to want to change if there's going to be no validation or recognition at the end of the day.
What about I want to talk to you about family enmeshment.
Mm, mm.
Um, what is that?
So, family enmeshment is basically when a family becomes codependent. So, there is possibly or are a lot of dysfunctional type of behavior from different family members. Because, look, at the end of the day, the person that's struggling with the substance is not necessarily the only person in the family system that's struggling. Somebody else might be overworking themselves. Somebody else might be, quite dependent on um, let's say eating too much, or I think every person has a way of coping with difficulty. We all have something we generally turn to try and kind of self-soothe in a way, and it might often be self-destructive things. The problem with substances is it's in your face. You can smell it, you can see it. I always say to my patients, I can stand in front of you with 500,000 rand of gambling debt and you wouldn't know it because I can hide it. So this enmeshment is basically that the family itself has become dysfunctional, but they are basically enabling one another.
Is it something that is it also like kind of like the dual relationship thing? Is that part of enmeshment?
Yes. So basically,
So like your dad's your boss, and he's your dad, and he's your friend, and
yes, there's not clear boundaries
Sure.
of hierarchy or which one plays which role in the family. So then often it would be, okay, but because you did this, I'm going to do this. Or you covered, or I covered for you the last time, so you now have to cover for me. Or last time you did this, so that, justifies for us to do something else. So it really becomes a manipulative type of relationship
from all angles, eh?
from all
Sure.
angles. And unfortunately, the enmeshment makes the family not necessarily see that. So people around them can see it. Objective parties like friends or extended family can say, listen here, something about the system isn't really working. But the family is so enmeshed that they keep on, they almost in denial together.
Sure.
They all of them are in denial, and they're all feeling guilty or in some way accountable. So they all kind of try and justify or rationalize their choices or their behavior. And at the end of the day, that often just allows for that type of behavior to cycle. And it can even cycle through generation to generation to generation. And, the family goes and say, but why are we this dysfunctional over so many generations? And each one blames it on the previous generation. But it's because there's not a little bit of space to look at things objectively and say, you know what, let me maybe just focus on my part in this and take responsibility or accountability for what I can change. Because if every person takes accountability, the whole system will shift at the end of the day. They're also quite protective often. And
Enmeshed families.
yes,
Sure.
so they cover for, or they protect their secrets or their dysfunctionality.
Sure.
So that would often be families that would say, no, we're not forming part of the rehab process. It's that person's problem, it's their responsibility. So we don't want much involvement. We're not really involved in any of this. But I think it's often because they're resistant of what may come out or what might be discussed if all of them were to be in one room together.
Yeah, that could go sideways.
Interesting.
Sure. I mean, we've had experiences where things have gone sideways in a family meeting. Hey?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, look, I often say to the patients, if especially your first family therapy session, if that didn't go very well, it's in some way actually a good thing, because then at least we got things on the table. At least there's some form of uncomfortability because there's conversations that's being had. People are sharing opinions, people are coming out with feelings. If a family therapy session goes almost too well and everything is peachy and rosy, then we're also thinking, what is being, like I said, covered up here, or how are people
Swept
holding
under
back?
the rug. Sure.
Because that's often the families. I get the phone call from 3 weeks or a month after rehab saying, we're completely back to square one. And then only everything starts to come forth. So I think there should be some level of discomfort in family therapy.
Okay. So I think the family function is an important process. It doesn't have to happen in rehab though. That's something that I've also realized. If things are too raw, too painful, whatever the case, then there can be an outpatient process or whatever. But I think again, in early recovery, you know, at some point, I think it is important for everybody to kind of like get involved in a process where, like you say, everyone starts taking accountability for their own sort of issues.
Mm.
And if that doesn't happen, okay, if the family isn't supportive, if they don't care for 1 second to be involved, or and they've got their own problems and they so on, then that's fine too. I think for the patient, I think it's important for them to focus on their process and continue to work
Mm. Mm.
on themselves.
I always say to my patients, a supportive family structure is not going to make or break your recovery
And
at the end of the day.
on what planet is there? Are there perfect
No,
families? Yeah,
yes,
sure.
100%. Because at the end of the day, I always ask my patients, when you are really at the point of relapsing, do you phone your family? No.
Mm.
Majority of them would tell me, I've never phoned a family member or loved one. If I'm standing in front of the bottle store, or I'm on my way to my dealer's house, or I'm standing in the queue of the pharmacy, they don't phone their family members, because even if they are the most understanding, supportive family, they're not going to engage with the family, because the conversation happens in here. It's an internal conflict, and involving another person, for them it feels like that's going to complicate the situation. For them they're driving and they're trying to figure out, should I not? So like I said, whether you have the most supportive or involved or understanding neutral family, that's not necessarily going to get you to, or when it comes to crunch time or to the the brink of relapsing, is going to make that big of a difference. Yes, it can be a preventative measure or a buffer to getting you to that point, but at the end of the day, I have many patients that unfortunately, due to several circumstances, don't have that involved family, and they're still making it in their recovery. So there's no hard and fast rule that if you don't have that, you're not going to make it, because that's where obviously also support group meetings and sponsorship comes in, because they become your family at the end of the day.
Sure. I mean, a sense of community is important, right? And if you can't find that from within your family, then yeah, sure. Then there are those fellowships or organizations or mutual self-help groups where you can form connections with other people. And I think that is incredibly important. I've sponsored people, okay, before, and I've had their parents phone me. It's happened where somebody's mother phones me and says, "Listen, I want to just check on this Oaks process. How's he doing?" And that's not a conversation that I really want to have with someone's mom.
Yeah.
I think that's probably another example of like maybe a parent sort of being overly controlling. Because I mean, we can take things to that extreme as well, where parents are like, they'll drag the person to rehab by the ear and then monitor every single step of the process, okay, and then sort of just be like overbearingly controlling, right?
Yes, and I think that was that's something that I always say to family members and the patient. Trust the process, trust the process. There's a reason why we only involve the family a bit later in rehab. It's not that we want to shut you out, or that we want to give the patient enough time to manipulate us, because that's a remark I get a lot, is the family would, they've dropped the patient off, I'm walking them to the door, and they would tell me, but just know this person is highly manipulative. Like, we know that. It's not to say that we're giving them enough time to pull the wool over our eyes, but we do need to give them time to settle in so that we can see their true, authentic self, their defenses, their insecurities, if the family just swoops in and kind of gives us all that information, the patient tends to draw back and say, oh, well, the family's talking on my behalf, so, and the psychologist is in any case going to just believe what the family says, so whatever, let them just, rule and regulate the process. Then we're not working on the patient's outcome, we're working on the family's expectations, and I think that's something to, again, balance. So, I mean, yes, the family should form part, but there should be a little bit of trust in the process, that whether it be the psychologist or whether it be the sponsor, that they also can play a certain part of, monitoring the person's process. A person can't have full control at the end of the day. And you also need to ask yourself, is that potentially a trigger for the patient? is the controlling nature of the family as well something that puts them under a lot of pressure, heightens anxiety, that eventually becomes the trigger for wanting to use, because I mean, using is a form of escape, a form of, numbing, a form of suppressing. So that's also something to look at. And I think that's why it's important that the psychologist or whomever spends a bit of time with the family as well, so that they can understand the family's dynamics, how they engage. So yes, I think there should be a level of
I mean,
trust.
it could be quite a difficult thing for a controlling member of a family to hear, the words, "Hey, listen, you need to take a step back now."
Yes.
So